Hello and welcome to Asia in Depth. I'm Matt Schiavenza. The conventional wisdom about China's recent economic history goes something like this. The Chinese Communist Party implemented market reforms and transformed the country into an export-driven economic powerhouse, one that has lifted up living standards for the once impoverished population and turned China into a global juggernaut. Now, of course, this global juggernaut is being challenged by the staggering impact of the coronavirus. But according to Dexter Roberts, this long-standing narrative about China doesn't tell the full story. Roberts, a journalist who spent 23 years in the country, is the author of the new book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. He argues that China's economic miracle has left hundreds of millions in the countryside behind. In the course of the book, Roberts travels to Dongguan, a bustling factory town in the Pearl River Delta, where migrant workers and factories struggle to make ends meet. He also visits remote Guizhou province, where life for residents does not match the stereotypical vision of Chinese wealth. Roberts recently spoke with Asia Society Executive Vice President Tom Nagorski at Asia Society, New York. He began by assessing China's handling of the coronavirus outbreak.
They started with a tremendously damaging cover-up. We know sort of the dimensions of it. We had a doctor who, in a small WeChat group, was warning other doctors that there was a very strange pneumonia in their hospital, and he was punished. He was reprimanded. He was called in by the public security, the police, and said, "You're spreading dangerous rumors. It's bad for social stability, and that you can be punished for that in China." And he basically signed something saying, "I retract that." A recent research that's just come out suggests that if they had identified the severity of the coronavirus three weeks earlier, there would have been 95% fewer infections. 1 week was, something 60% fewer infections. So many people got sick, and frankly, people died because of the initial cover-up. And so that's really quite awful what happened then. And they paid for it, and frankly, we're paying for it around. It's an issue around the world as the coronavirus spreads. After they decided that they were going to treat this more seriously. But by the way, in the interim as well, they had their biggest political meeting of the year in Wuhan, the Wuhan Party Congress. Part of the reason it seems that they did not announce it earlier was because they wanted to get their political meeting done, which is very important to them. They had a huge banquet that brought in tens of thousands of families. And at that time, officials knew that there was a problem. Right. So I find that reprehensible. The second stage, something very different. The mass mobilizations, the lockdowns, the halt to transportation, the halt to the economy, basically, no doubt stemmed the spread of this, the spread of the disease. And that's something, the mass testing, which, here in the United States, by contrast, we're doing an atrocious job at. Yeah. We don't know how serious it is because we're not testing anyone, or we're testing very few people so far. Those are all things that we could actually learn from.
Right. And I really don't want to make this conversation all about this issue, but there was one nugget that the WHO official who went really mentioned and stuck with me, which is, I don't know the name of these, they're very, very high, high quality ventilators that I guess are super important when you have people who do have the disease or any kind of high-grade pneumonia, even dangerous flu, that are once they're not going to prevent it, but they're going to help save your life potentially. He said that in a good U.S. hospital, and he's seen his share, 3, 4, 5 is about the right number. He said every hospital he went to in the affected areas had about 40 or 50 of these. And is that the kind of thing that surprises you in terms of medical infrastructure that exists there? Or I'm I don't want to put you on the spot.
No. I think. First of all, he went to exactly the hospitals they chose for him to see.
Sure.
And the idea that most hospitals in China are outfitted with that kind of technology is just not a fact. It's not true. I mean, one of the things I deal with in my book is the great gap between rural healthcare and urban healthcare, and it's dramatically different.
Right.
So I think. Again, urban hospitals can be very impressive in China. And it's happened. Actually, it happened in the years that I was living there. They weren't very impressive in the 90s when I arrived.
Yeah. Now, it must be a very strange experience, I would think, for you to. I actually worked for just a couple of years as a journalist in Russia, and right after I left, this will betray my age, but right after I left, there was Boris Yeltsin was in power, and there was almost a civil war in Russia. The parliament was attacked and all this. But what's it like to have been there for 20 years and then see from a distance this just colossal story, which of course now is a global story. It's not just a China story. Did you have any, beyond the things we've talked about already, any thoughts, given your experience and your knowledge of the government and the society and everything else as you've watched this unfold?
Well, I have a real concern. I have many friends. I have relatives in China as well, and they've been dealing with these lockdowns and fears for their health. So it's personal in that sense. As working as a journalist there, frankly, sometimes I felt like we were lurching from disaster to to amazing economic success. There was, as I said, I covered SARS. I covered China's entry to the World Trade Organization, and sort of back and forth. So I don't really have more to say about it than that. I'm very concerned, and I'm very pleased to see what appears to be China starting to get a handle on this.
Yep.
At least in the cities.
So let's get to your book, and let's start with a really fundamental question. It's a provocative title, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. Explain what you mean. What's the myth in your view?
So the myth of my title, sort of broadly speaking, is that China is becoming more capitalistic. What do I mean by capitalistic? Really what I'm saying is that the very impressive reform path that they set upon with Deng Xiaoping and continued with China's entry into the World Trade Organization way back in 2001 is going to keep continuing. And what we've seen in the last few years, the last 5 years, particularly since the last leadership took over under Xi Jinping, is a real stalling of that reform. Another myth that I'm looking at, or that I think I'm examining, and I believe is a myth, is this idea that China will continue to keep growing its middle class. Depending on how you count it, it's several 100 million strong. People have different ways of counting the middle class. There's been this sense that we did see a tremendous improvement in living standards in the cities, and many people move into the middle class. This idea that this will now continue into the countryside, into the lack of a better expression, the other China, the migrant workers and the farmers, I think is very much suspect. I do not see that happening.
Yeah. So maybe if I can go, before we burrow into that and the stats and everything else, to maybe a slightly outsiders, maybe even slightly superficial question, but as an occasional visitor to China, right? Chinese capitalism doesn't seem like a myth at all. It seems like everywhere, I mean, not everywhere, because those of us who go infrequently and go for short periods of time typically don't go to the rural areas that you spend a great deal of time in, in the book. But it's hard, even when you just go at 1 year or 2 year increments, to not be stunned by, pick your metric, just the incredible burst of construction, high-speed rail, infrastructure that we wish as Americans, right, that we had, the ability to take, what's happened recently, to just suddenly put up a hospital in 10 days. So a good deal of your book is really about what we're missing, those of us who visit, even if we visit with relative frequency, when we think, well, there's no myth here.
Yeah, so, undeniably there's been, tremendous progress. They made a goal of eliminating absolute poverty, I think, this year, and they're basically on track to do that. They have a centennial goal next year, which will be the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party.
They're very good at setting goals, right?
Yes, they are, yes, and often meeting them. And this goal is to have average per capita income be $10,000, and it's going to be a little tougher now with the virus and the downturn in the economy, but they're close if they don't actually make it, and they'll probably make it shortly after that. So, and there's been an explosion of wealth in the cities. So what I'm arguing in my book, and what I see as the myth, is the idea that this tremendous progress that we have seen, including in infrastructure, high-speed rail, has really translated into benefiting the whole population, or even most of the population. Right. It really, I argue, is something that has had a tremendously positive impact on about half the people's lives there. There's things that are happening that it's also been accompanied, frankly, by a massive explosion in income and wealth inequality, which is alarming to the leadership themselves, because they know that people aren't always, that can actually cause social tensions, and it is causing social tensions in China.
So, and that last thing also would surprise, I think, occasional readers, viewers, what have you, in this country and other parts of the world, because, again, I mentioned in the introduction, and you mentioned early on in your book, the implicit bargain is your phrase that was put forward by Deng Xiaoping, what are we now, 30, almost 40 years ago.
Yeah, almost 40.
That you're a citizen of China. You agree to not push the envelope much as an individual, or certainly in a group of any kind, in terms of civil rights, political rights, and so forth. In return, our bargain is your livelihood, your way of life, your material situation will be lifted. And I guess from what you just said and what you say in the book, the bargain has worked for a great many people, but then a great many people not. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, and it's actually it was working for most people for a long time. But what I see is that it has been very effective. It has been a bargain that the urban middle class have absolutely bought into. And one of the myths I look at as well is this idea that with rising living standards and higher education levels, people are going to start to demand more civil rights.
That was Bill Clinton's thesis,
absolutely,
wasn't it?
when he had his justification for lifting or giving China most favored nation trading status. So this has been the sort of the implicit assumption that those of us that have hoped that there would be political reform to follow economic reform have had about China. And the fact is, it really hasn't happened. And there's actually some very interesting research out in my book, which looks at the fact that basically the richer Chinese people, the better off Chinese people become and better educated, the less likely they are to actually protest anything or try to demand more civil rights.
Probably true in a lot of places.
Yeah, I think it's probably true in a lot of places. But and I was guilty of it at one point as well. It was this sort of assumption, the NIMBY argument, not in my backyard. You get yourself an apartment and your life's good, and then a factory starts polluting next to you, and you're going to tell the government you can't have that factory there. And there was a lot of the environmental movement in China started to a degree from that. But that's just not the case today in China. And one of the things I mention is, interestingly enough, some of the protests that we have seen by urban Chinese has been actually resistance to the reform of policies to allow more migrant children to enter the schools. So the urban parents who are like, the last thing, it's already hard enough to get my child into a good school. The last thing I want to do is to allow the rest of China to have the same rights.
Talk a little bit about protest movements in China. That's another thing that, I would venture that 9 out of 10, maybe 99 out of 100 people who don't go to China much, even if they read occasionally about it, think, well, that just doesn't happen, right? But we know that it does, and I also, it's if there's a cliche there, born of Tiananmen or Hong Kong, it's that if there are going to be protests, it's for greater democracy. It's not true, really, is it? I mean, talk a bit about what you have seen and learned over the years about protest in China, in the mainland.
Yeah, well, what I do look at a lot in the book, and what I looked at a lot as a reporter before, is labor protests.
Right.
Protests between the migrant workers and the management of these factories for, in some cases, very bad abuses that they've faced in the factories. And those kinds of protests, by the way, continue virtually every day.
Right.
And it's almost it's been a contest for the party to try to make sure that they stay localized, to make sure that they don't link up across different companies, even worse, different industries, or cross-regionally. So China's the government and the parties become very effective at basically isolating protests. Typically what they would do is, as another scholar referred to, use a combination of repression and responsiveness. So they would go in there and they would see what the problem was. The workers aren't being paid enough. They'd try to get the factory managers to pay them more. But at the same time, they figure out who actually organized this protest. And they would give them, very often very extreme sentences, put them in jail as a warning to the rest of them. So they've approached them in both ways. But I guess the bigger point is those protests continue, and they haven't gone away even when we don't hear about them.
Right.
Some of the larger ones have been contained. I write about in the book these massive protests around factories that were Adidas suppliers, and that sort of thing we haven't seen in a number of years. But I find it hard to believe that we won't see more of that going forward, particularly as the economy continues to slow, which I'm quite sure it will. Yeah. That's when the implicit bargain, it wasn't serving the rural people or the migrants as well in the first place, and it just starts to fray a bit as the economy slows.
And there's a lot of things behind that, but maybe this is a good moment just to ask you to talk a little bit about, because there's a lot of different ways you could have written a book and told the story of what we're talking about. I think it's impressive and interesting that you chose not just some interesting individuals, but also it seems like the main characters really are places. And I hope I get the pronunciation right, but those main characters would be, in one case, the village of Binghuachun and the sprawling city of Dongguan. The village where, dirt poor, and for reasons anyone can understand, whether they've been in China or not, people who want to get somewhere where they have a chance at a better livelihood. And then Dongguan, a destination for many of those and other migrants, really a kind of dateline for the juggernaut of Chinese manufacturing and everything else. Talk a little bit about those places and how you came to make them main characters in your book.
Well, the first year that I visited both of those places was 2000.
And how long had you been in China at that point?
I'd been in China for 5 years. I was actually 23 years in China.
Okay.
So I'd been in China for 5 years. 1999, China and the U.S. signed the bilateral accession agreement to the WTO. We knew that China was entering in 2001 because that agreement between the U.S. and China was the key one. Other countries had to sign agreements, but now that the U.S. and China had it settled, it was going forward. And there was sort of this ferment about how WTO can change China, and not just change factory towns, which were quite small, much smaller then, but also the interior, as money and investment and managerial know-how would flow into China. And so I went down there. I was doing a story specifically on it was a cover story for Business Week magazine. It was called The Great Migration. So I went there to see migrants who worked in factories who also came and also hoped to see their villages. And went to Dongguan. I'd been to Dongguan before, covering the growth of the Taiwanese community, who basically make up the factory managers there before, I think the year before. So it was maybe my second visit. But I went there this time to talk to the workers and met these workers, and they were extremely interesting and good people, open people, and Next thing I knew, a couple months later, I was heading back to their village in Guizhou, to the place you mentioned, Binghuacun, to meet them. And this was a real eye-opener for me. If you remember back then, it was also in China. There was a lot of attention on the internet boom sweeping China, and a lot of media, including Businessweek, where I worked.
Another thing that they thought was going to change the whole country.
That's right. That's right. And I just, for whatever my own preferences, was not really that interested. I didn't go to China to write about people that had done their Harvard MBAs and returning Chinese and worked at McKinsey and then decided to start a company. So I specifically was interested in meeting these people that I had some contact with, and more importantly, I knew they were out there and I knew they were important to the economic model of China. So anyway, I went there and I went to Dongguan, I went to Binghuacun, and both those places, they fit the bill. That was the migrant model back then.
Yeah. Huh. And how much time ultimately would you say you spent in these places? Because it certainly seems from the book like it's a lot.
Yeah, I've actually lost track of the number of times I visited. I visited the village, many times. I visited Dongguan dozens and dozens of times, and for other stories as well. And just quickly, those places are very relevant today for China. So maybe I'm getting ahead of us, but
that's okay.
but now the idea is as the Chinese economic model tries to change, as factories are automated, these same migrant workers are trying to sort of reinvent themselves, and they're being told by the government in no uncertain terms, it's time to go home and figure out a new way to function. So places like Binghuacun today is trying to reinvent itself, in their case, as sort of almost an ecotourism place, which would be wonderful because it's a beautiful place. Mm-hmm. It has wonderful food, by the way, spicy food from Guizhou, and a little similar to what the Chuansai, Sichuan food. Mm-hmm. And it's just stunningly beautiful. These green mountains, sort of karst mountains, like in neighboring Guangxi.
Yeah.
We're going to take a short break here to relay an important message about the coronavirus outbreak from Asia Society. At Asia Society, the health and safety of our staff, visitors, volunteers, members, and communities is our first priority. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have made the difficult decision to close our New York headquarters beginning March 16th. Many of our locations and offices worldwide are taking similar measures. Commonly referred to as the coronavirus, COVID-19's impact is felt around the world, and the virus does not discriminate based on race, class, or national origin. Asia Society remains committed to our founding principles of promoting mutual understanding and strengthening links between the people, leaders, and institutions of Asia and the world. At this important time, Asia Society vows to continue our critical work, and we will use our digital tools to continue programming via webcasts, podcasts, social media, our website, and other channels. And now let's get back to Dexter Roberts and Tom Nagorski.
I remember about the same time, actually, about 20 years ago, I went to China. And we were focused on what was then, still a kind of new world of getting out of the old state-run factories in some places. And we were invited to visit as journalists with people who were, widget factory number 2 or what have you in Shanghai. And they brought us to a restaurant where all these people were just being picked up, basically, because that was a dead industry, and said, here, you're going to work in the service sector, and you are going to be a cook, and you are going to be a waiter, and you are going to be this. So when you go back to the village, did they dream up the ecotourism, or did the government say, hey, this is going to be a good thing for you to find some success?
I think with encouragement from the government, Guizhou was basically anointed a tourism center.
Right.
Not only that, it's also supposed to be the big data center for China. So you have this this awesome business park outside the capital city, where you have big investors, the big top China telecom companies, China Mobile, China Telecom. You have Foxconn, the supplier for Apple. They've all set up shop there, and that's very much government mandated. but also on the tourism side. So it's really a combination. On the tourism side, you also have, there's a program they have where they designate a number of top state enterprises or successful companies, and they are supposed to go and contribute to the national economic health by investing in places like Guizhou. And they have been told in Guizhou to set up quote-unquote ecotourism. What it is, in fact, is in some cases these massive, sometimes garish resorts that are spread around the country. And frankly, I think they're going to struggle to actually fill them with tourists.
Right. But a lot of that at least seems like it is a potential road for people who, the migrant labor doesn't work anymore, the model doesn't work, as a potential road to something that could, wend your way back into the Chinese middle class. But your book certainly suggests that road is fraught at the moment, right?
Yes. I mean, so that's on the entrepreneurial side. There's all sorts of pitfalls. I have friends who've gone back and have basically become bankrupt because they don't necessarily have the skills to be business people. And actually, a lament I heard a lot from migrant friends of mine was, I just spent 20 years far from my village, and I go back there, and I'm a stranger, and I'm supposed to set up a business, and I even talk funny now because I learned
all that.
And doesn't necessarily always mean a successful model, and that's on the entrepreneurial side. On the service side, there's been this hope from the government that that a large number they want to make a more service-driven economy, more consumption economy, and there's been this idea that somehow they will find better paying service jobs. They can be trained for them, and whether it's in online commerce companies or developing apps for mobile phones, they're supposedly supposed to do that. But the reality is much of the service jobs that they've done are very low end. And I mean, one of the most common jobs you now see in the big cities is motorcycle delivery people.
Sure.
And it's a brutal business. They're paid by how many packages they deliver. They have no time to eat.
Right.
They have no time to stop. As a result, there's a terrible online occupational safety issue. There's all these terrible traffic accidents. And that's in the cities, that's the most common new migrant worker job.
Right. And we skated past this before, but when you talk about a broken model for migrant labor and for places like Dongguan, I assume a big part of that is that cheap labor, which was the calling card, right, for the incredible growth in much of certainly that part of China, is now they're getting beat in terms of the low price of labor by the likes of Vietnam, Bangladesh, right? I mean, is that...
Absolutely. I mean, this might even be surprising. Mexico and Malaysia now are apparently cheaper for your average manufacturing wage. Right. So China, in an extent, has priced themselves out of that. So this is a real reason. This is a reason why they're trying to make this momentous economic shift right now. The old factory to the world model doesn't work. Right. They want to keep their manufacturing, by the way. They just want to automate it and bring in robots. And there's a whole very detailed and very well-financed government plan to try to drive the automation of factories.
Right. Now, I do want to, well, actually, let me ask you another question before we get to some forecasting and some prognostication. When did we have so many people who come to the Asia Society, background in all kinds of countries. China certainly seems to lead the way for whatever reason. And I always like to ask people who are not initially from China how they first got the bug or how they first went. And I know you studied, but when did you first go? When did you first sort of think, was it as a student or as the first visit you made that you kind of figured, or maybe you didn't figure, that you're going to be a 23-year guy in China?
Yeah, well, I started to study Chinese in
Stanford, right?
At Stanford, and this will date me, but it was so far back that my advisor told me you should study Japanese because that's where the economic future is. So it was the 80s.
We're in the same vintage.
So, and I like to pretend, although I always admit that this is not the case, but I like to say, Well, we might think that I was amazingly far-seeing, and I knew that China would become the world's second largest economy, which is nonsense. I was really more just stubborn and interested in China. I took an introductory class to Chinese philosophy and started to study Chinese politics and economics. So that was in college. Right after graduation, I continued language studies in Taipei. That was back when Taipei was still. Now most students from the United States would probably, almost all of them, go to the mainland, but back then it was different. So that was in 1988. Fast forward, did some time here in New York at graduate school and so on. In 95, I moved to Beijing, and I had decided that I wasn't going to become a professor, which I thought I might do at one point, and I wanted to be a journalist, and so I headed to Beijing.
Yeah. Wow. Timing is everything. Right? Yeah. So let's do a little forecasting before we wrap things here. You get the sense, not only from what you're saying here, but from your book, that there's some dark clouds on this horizon that even before the coronavirus has seemed very rosy for China. Whether it's journalists writing about it, scholars writing about it. And you've mentioned some of the reasons for that, income inequality being a big one, some social unrest or whatever. That said, we've had an awful lot of people on this stage at the Asia Society over the years who, for whatever reason, have said, those rough times are coming for China and bubbles are going to burst and what have you. And yet there seems to, year after year, they seem to, whether they make their GDP mark or whatever, the doomsayers are proven wrong often.
Yes.
So, not that you're prognosticating doom, but why convince our audience that that they should be not so bullish on China at the moment?
So the argument that I make in the book, and I believe, is that China's facing really the biggest economic transition since Deng Xiaoping, and that's moving from this investment-driven factory to the world model, and based on selling relatively low-cost goods to the world. And that, of course, as we've discussed, has been based on low-cost labor, and that model is no longer viable. And the Chinese government, to give them absolute credit, they're very aware of this. Right. They know that they have to shift. Right. It's extremely ambitious. They want to move to a far more domestic consumption-driven economy, a far more service-driven economy. They also want to move up the tech ladder, so they're producing, goods of a far higher technology content that it can be globally competitive. So the argument of my book is, that's a wonderful thing to do, and I wish them success in it. I don't think it's possible for them to actually become a high-tech company, a high-tech economy that's globally successful, producing these globally competitive goods in technology, and most importantly, be powered to a great degree by the domestic economy, if about half the population is systematically left out. And that's just not on the income level.
Right.
And they can't spend, so they can't become the consumers to replace the world's consumers to a degree. But they're also getting education that's very bad.
Right.
We have the Chinese government won't fess up to some of these numbers, but independent researchers that have done very rigorous work in the Chinese countryside find that dropout rates in high school for rural kids are extremely high. It may be something like 25% of people with rural hukou are finishing high school, according to some people's estimates. You can't have a population where half of the people are being left behind. They don't have a lot of money to spare. They're getting poorly educated. Their health may not be very good. And expect this transition to succeed. And so I always come back to that. I also have seen the tremendous progress. I've seen all the problems as well. But I come back to that. I just don't think it's possible. And again, they know they need to change this. They did announce, part of it is, there's a couple crucial policies, the household registration policy or the hukou policy, that is responsible for people getting far worse, education and health care. The dual land system, which makes it very difficult for people in the countryside to monetize their land. Back in 2013, at one of their third plenum meetings, there was this bold blueprint for growth, which basically saw these policies done away with, and they've made virtually no progress.
Yeah, and I guess the migrant labor model being, so problematic now. I mean, there's not much to migrate for anymore, right? I mean, there is, but it's not. So to what extent has that, do the villagers in the village, and I'm now Bingwachin, to what extent do they, would you say, do they still want to go someplace else, and is it just a matter that there isn't an obvious place to go to anymore, or are they trying to make a go of it with all these new industries that are in the province that you
Many
mentioned?
of them would love to, or are happy if they already have. I mean, they're trying to make a go of it back in their hometowns.
Right.
And most of the people that I first met in the Mo's that I first met in 2000 told me at the time, all I want to see is my village develop, and someday, after slaving away, doing this very difficult work in the factories, I want to save enough money to go back and start a little business or do something. So they would like to be there. So that's not not all of them. There's another person in my book, Rubois, who had no intention to ever go back. So he's still trying to make a go of it in the city. But the problem isn't necessarily that they have to go back to their village. It's just really unclear how they can make an economic go of it now.
Yeah. Is there anything, I'm putting you on the spot in all these ways because you're not an epidemiologist and you're not an advisor to the government. Is there something you think the Chinese ought to be doing or could be doing that would mitigate against some of these problems you're talking about that might, if you put yourself in the next plenum meeting, or I mean, what?
Well, I think they've actually mapped out the path ahead. In the 2013 third plenum, they've spent a lot of money on trying to improve rural health care and education, which is admirable. A lot of money.
Right.
I would argue that the thing that they absolutely need to do, and they've done very little on, is simply to end these policies. The household registration or the hukou policy and the dual land system, and actually allow people to work where they want to work, bring their children there with them, let their children, some of this costs money, some of it doesn't. There's an argument about how much money it costs to integrate migrants into the city and their families. Some policymakers in China think that actually they're very hardworking, they'll generate taxes, and it doesn't have to cost that much. But there's this fear that it costs too much, and that's a problem. So I would say stepping away and saying, okay, these policies were created in the 50s in both cases. They're ancient history, and they've done a very good job at moving away from other legacy policies.
Why keep these?
And why keep these? And we could get into why. There's a number of reasons, I think, why it's difficult. But that's what they need to do.
But without all those reasons, what would you say? Is there any chance that those are gonna? I mean, they're not afraid. They're not afraid of taking, stark measures when they feel it's
7 years ago, they told their country, and they told the foreign journalists, the people that were paying attention that were not from their country, that they were going to quickly move to reform them step by step. And
here we are.
Yeah, and here we are. There's a number of issues. It's the localities, the cities don't want to pay the new social welfare costs of integrating the migrants.
Right.
A big one, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, is urban people in China are not really ready to see their schools and their medical clinics suddenly filled with a lot of people that previously were not allowed in.
That'll do it for this week's episode of Asia in Depth. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, and keep up with everything Asia Society related by following us on Facebook and Twitter @Asia Society. I'm Matt Schiavenza. See you next time.